Good evening. I'm Robert Kesten, Executive Director of Stonewall National Museum, Archives, and Library. And today I am extraordinarily happy to introduce you to Brendan Wolfe. But before we do, I just want to remind you that this coming Friday, we have our women's music event at the Art Serve building in downtown Fort Lauderdale. Anyone is welcome. It is focusing on the history of women's music with a particular focus on women of color. So there will be some old time music and some very contemporary music, highlighting some of these great voices and great personalities of women who have touched us that we may or may not even know are part of the LGBTQ community. So if you're available and you're around 6:30 on Friday at Art Serve in Fort Lauderdale. And we have a number of other events coming up. September 21st, we will be holding our SNEP, Stonewall National Education Project fundraising event with Billy Porter. That will be in Wilton Manors. And you can get your information and tickets online at stonewall-museum.org. And we have many, many other interviews that will be live on Zoom and Facebook Live and other programs that will be taking place over the next few weeks. But now it's time to talk to Brendan Wolfe and his book, A Place for Us, which clearly is the name of a song. How did you come up with the name?
It's funny, so the song didn't come up in the conversation about the title of this book, although it is a lovely song and I like the show too. But the name was a struggle because the working title for the book throughout most of the writing process was actually Safe Space. And I had everything on my computer saved as that sort of safe space theme. And I had become very emotionally attached to the idea of this book being called Safe Space. And then I remember I was actually keynoting the Netroots conference in Pittsburgh, and I was sitting in my hotel room and I had a call with the publisher, and I could see by the editor's face that we were going to have one of those conversations, one of the like, we're letting something go that you're emotionally attached to conversations. And so we got on and we started talking about the title, and she said, listen, we just think that safe space is a little fraught. We think that if we put it on a shelf, that may get reaction that causes people to turn their noses up before they even get a chance to read it. We wonder what you think about being open to other titles. And so we spent 90 minutes on that call going back and forth, coming up with different phrases, and I hated all of them. I'm like, this is not it. It doesn't give me the energy. Safe space was perfect. I don't know why we have to let it go. I'm like the whole grieving process. And then something hit us at the end of that call, right about at 90 minutes. And we said, what about A Place for Us? It captures the same energy of safe space, right? But it almost drills even deeper than that to not just any old safe space, but one for us, our community, us as people, us as friends, us as, lovers. It sort of captures the energy of the book that talks about these very intimate spaces we create for one another. So we landed on it. We went with it. I went through the rest of my grieving process alone. And then when I got the first look at the cover art, it was perfect. It just, as soon as I saw it on the page, I thought this is the title. This is the image. It's perfect exactly as it is.
So when did you realize that it was the name of the song?
Well, so I was like, pretty familiar with, I guess, the show, but I hadn't put two and two together. And so once I started sharing the cover art, and of course, we're part of the gay community, so everyone's commenting like, oh, it's like from that song. And I'm, yeah, sure. It's from the song. So I think it was really everybody else cueing me into the parallels. And here I was, by the way, more concerned because there's another book called A Place for Us. It's a novel, not a memoir. So I'm concerned that people are going to get confused between that. And the very first thing that comes to their mind is, oh, it's like that song.
You wrote a memoir, and you were not afraid to go to the most difficult places in order, it almost seemed, in order to provide comfort to people who are following in your footsteps and are going through those things now, and especially in Florida, Texas, Alabama, uh, how much of that played into your mind while you were writing?
It's interesting because we had a signing event in DC the week before the book launched. So the book's been out now for 3 weeks, I guess. I don't. It feels like a lifetime and also no time at all. But it's been out for about 3 weeks. And the week before that, we had a signing event in Washington DC, and my moderator was Chasten Buttigieg, who is a really good friend of mine and also helped me learn how to write a book. So shout out to Chasten. Thank you so much for teaching me what I know. And one of the, I think, most poignant questions he asked was, books in many ways, as we know, are both mirrors and windows. They're mirrors for people to see themselves reflected in a story, and also windows into other people's lived experiences that we may not have previously understood or been exposed to. And he asked me, how is this book a mirror and a window? And it goes to the question you're asking as well. I wanted this book to be a mirror for other LGBTQ people, and specifically those of color, who feel lost at the intersections of who they are, who look around at a world that seems to be sliding backward every day, a politics that is, being run off a right-wing cliff by people like Ron DeSantis, and wonder if it's even safe to be themselves in this world. They wonder if there's ever going to be a place for them in their community or in society in general. I wanted them to see themselves reflected in my story. I wanted to see themselves in the kid who was in high school and struggling to find his way, and the kid who went off to college and struggled to find his way. And I wanted them to see themselves in the guy who found purpose and has discovered, a newfound lease on life by trying to make the world a better place every day. And at the same time, I also wanted the book to be a window. And one of my favorite reviews that I've gotten, I wanted it to matter to people not just like me, but like my dad. And we talked a little bit earlier about my dad and I's relationship. My dad and I are very different, but I wanted this book to be an opportunity for people like my dad to see other people in a new light for the first time. And so one of my favorite reviews that I've gotten on Amazon started by saying, "I don't usually read memoir, and I'm not sure why I was drawn to yours. Perhaps it's because I'm the mother of a trans son that I'm struggling to understand and accept." And that for me is what I wanted from this book. I wanted the Black queer kid to pick it up and understand he belongs on planet Earth alongside everyone else. And I wanted that mom of a trans kid who's struggling to pick it up and, if for just a moment, be able to be vulnerable and honest about her relationship. And maybe it opens a new door to something different for them.
How old are your brother and sister, or brothers?
Yeah, I have two brothers and a sister. One of my brothers is, oh my gosh, how old am I? Okay, one of my brothers is 28. My sister is 27, and my youngest brother is 17.
Have any of them read the book?
That's a good question. I sent it to the family, and I didn't do a check-in to see who had finished it yet. They've been rotating it around. My sister, I think, has read it. I know my parents have read it. My grandparents have all read it. I don't know if my brother reads much, but I might have to press him to see if he's read it and what he thought of it.
Because that would be interesting as well, because for much of their formative years, you weren't there.
Yeah.
So how well they know you, or how well they think they know you, reading this book, I think, would therefore be a surprise.
Yeah, my sister sent me a beautiful text after the book came out, and she said much of that. She said, I'm really honored to have this book in the world because it gives me an opportunity to know you more. Obviously, I grew up as an only child for like 6, 7 years, and so there's this gap that almost makes me more like an uncle than a brother for them, and so I think she was really grateful for that opportunity. I know my cousins felt a lot of the same way because we knew each other, but we had different families, we had different life circumstances, and so I had another cousin reach out and just say, like, I'm just in awe to learn about all that you have traversed to get to where you are today. And again, my hope is that even for them, they can read this book and see a path for them too.
Right. But that path obviously is very different from yours, because they grew up very differently than you did in Jason Aldean's small town.
Right. Actually, a small town, because by the way, Jason Aldean did not grow up in a small town. His town had 200,000 people in it. You could come try that in my small town. How about that?
But that's what I'm saying. So even though your father didn't think it was that small, um, based on America's size, it was a small town.
Yeah.
And you grew up standing out
Yeah.
because of that, because of where you were and because of when it was. And it may be a little bit different now, but it sort of doesn't matter. But, you know, just a little while ago, you talked about the kids that are growing up in a country where they're not sure if they're allowed to be, where they're not sure if they fit in. You didn't grow up in that America. There were different presidents and different office holders then, and a lot of the world didn't feel that same pressure that you felt. How do you correlate with what's going on now with your growing up experience and what you know of the landscape? And I'm not talking necessarily political landscape, but social, emotional landscape. Were you harder on yourself than you needed to be? Was that small town really just like America was even 50 years before that? I mean,
Yeah.
what was it?
Yeah. It's so interesting to look at the parallels and also the things that are so different from the time when I was in, middle and high school to now. And what I've done is I've traveled the country and talked about the book and sort of talked about my journey, is I've tried to put things in a timeline sort of vision for people so they can see this is what it looked like when I was in school. And actually the parallels to this moment we're in are kind of shocking in some ways. I was in high school. I was a sophomore in high school in 2004 when George Bush was running for reelection. And for folks who remember, George Bush was deeply unpopular. He had started a war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and he was just, he was underwater across the country. He was really struggling with the idea of being reelected, and part of his strategy was to engage evangelicals to weaponize same-sex marriage essentially across the country and build this coalition of right-wing conservative voters who would help usher him in a re-election. And so there was this state-by-state strategy to try to ban same-sex marriage that resulted in a lot of the same rhetoric that we're hearing today, right? It's like LGBTQ people are indoctrinating children. They're going to be the downfall of marriage. They want to destroy the family unit in America. It was all of those things. And that was happening when I was a sophomore in high school. That very same year, my home state of Oregon banned same-sex marriage by constitutional amendment. And I can remember what it felt like to be walking the halls while people outside are all debating whether or not your love is ever going to be as valuable as anybody else's. And so when I think about how that sort of mirrors some of the things that young people are going through today, the parallels again are very striking, but also it's a different time. I mean, we didn't have social media when I was in high school. We didn't have Twitter. We didn't have Instagram. And so there wasn't this.
We don't have Twitter anymore.
We don't have Twitter anymore. It's X now. Sorry, we didn't have X at the time. But it was we were sort of blind to the world that was around us. There were many instances where I couldn't even imagine whole communities full of Black queer people because I had just never experienced it before, and there was no easy way at my fingertips for me to go and find it or see it or experience it. So in some ways, I think politically, young people are experiencing a lot of the same tensions in society that I was experiencing. Now they're probably more around gender identity than sexual orientation, but in other ways, it's very different because they have access to communities and information that I never had access to at the time.
And also when you were growing up, that the whole focus on trans didn't exist.
Right. Correct.
And
we were not having conversations about transgender people at all.
And that has been a major focal point because it's the easiest point for a politician to divide and conquer.
Right.
Because it's still relatively new in lexicon and so therefore stands out. How did you feel? And I know this isn't in the book, but because the book goes around all of those things, how did you feel when Obama became president or when Obama was president?
Yeah. What an incredible moment. So to take you back to that point in my life, I moved to Florida in August of 2008. So you can imagine we're right before an election cycle. And by the way, I'm moving not to Ron DeSantis's Florida, I'm moving to Barack Obama's Florida. There was that energy around me all the time. Orlando is already a fairly progressive place. I would say, I would argue that in many ways, we have the most progressive leadership right now in the state. We've got people like Maxwell Frost, who's the first Gen Z member of Congress. We've got people like Anna Eskamani in the state house. We've got potentially, hopefully, State Senator Carlos Guillermo Smith coming in this next election cycle. So Orlando has always had that progressive vein to it. And I think people are really proud of the way we're forward thinking in this community. But that was almost supercharged at that time because Barack Obama had, had inspired so many people to show up. So many people were knocking on doors and there were so many hope stickers everywhere. It felt like a really new beginning for me. And it's not like politically I was coming from a vastly different environment in terms of the 2008 election, right? Oregon was pretty progressive too, obviously voting for Barack Obama. But there was something different in terms of the diversity in Florida that I had never experienced before. Oregon is not a very demographically diverse place. I grew up in a overwhelmingly majority white community. Portland is a very white city in general. There are, of course, there's diversity there, but in general, Oregon is just not very demographically diverse. And moving to Florida felt like just total culture shock. It was like a world that was so much bigger than I ever could have imagined, was right before my eyes. And at the same time, we were in the moment of electing our first Black president. And so it was that whole energy. And I remember when the election was called, when Florida specifically was called, people pouring out of the apartments into the parking lot, banging pots and pans and playing instruments. It was very celebratory. And it, for me, marked, again, this new beginning for me as a person, as an adult, as a Black queer individual in America. It felt like, for the first time, perhaps, I could imagine myself being me in an environment like that.
But his mother was white, his father was Black,
Right.
the same as you.
Right.
Did you feel a personal sense of arriving?
Yeah, I did. I did. What's funny about that is even when I was working, I had two jobs when I was in college. One of them was at a pizza place, an Italian restaurant. And I was the host at that restaurant. So I would be seating people. When we got closer toward the election, just before I moved to Florida, people would constantly ask me if I was related to Barack Obama. Now, we could go back and say, maybe that's because they didn't have a great grasp on the fact that all Black people don't look the same. But every time I would be walking someone to their table, they would ask me, like, oh my gosh, you look just like Barack Obama. And so there was a sense at that time when I finally, got to Florida and he was elected and there was this big celebration. It was not just this new beginning for me because I'm in a new place with more diversity and I'm around LGBTQ people more than I ever have been before, but there's someone who looks like me and has a really similar family makeup to me that's now been elected president of the United States. It felt like a cultural arrival for someone like me as well, in a space where people had often said the world's just never going to be ready for someone like you. You're going to have so many obstacles and issues to overcome if you ever want to be anything other than the four things we've decided people like you can be. And so to see someone at the same time that I'm making a huge life change in an effort to find a place to belong, to see someone like me at the highest level was, I think, really profound. It was timely. And when I had the opportunity to meet him in 2016, it felt full circle for me. I mean, just standing there in his presence, it's been a big deal to watch him on that same journey as I'm figuring out my own.
How did that change in you, because it was still early enough on in your time in Orlando? Your memoir talks about your friendship and how important friendship is. I don't want to give too much away because I really do think that people should read it, because you put everything out there and talking about it without having read the book is unfair to the people who are going to read the book. And the book is called A Place for Us, and it's by Brandon, and
Thank you.
you really should read it. Your courage in being so transparent, your courage in talking about how you felt, understanding very often that it was how you felt, and you understood that not everybody around you would ever share those same feelings. You had a friend, your best friend, Drew, who was outgoing and was not afraid of people, but welcomed people in. You were much more solitary. You were much more afraid. He was not afraid.
Right.
And yet, on the other side, here's this new president that is walking in the same footprints that you're following in, and the world, at least for a short moment, changed.
Yeah.
Yes, we've had a backlash since then, but we've had a backlash, I would say, or argue, because that president was respected around the world and liked at home, and
Right.
in some cases loved at home. And
Right.
that made a lot of people uncomfortable.
100%.
And now, of course, in Florida, there are laws that you can't make people feel uncomfortable,
Right.
which means that they can't teach physics anymore.
No, I think you're right that there was so much happening at the moment that I came to Orlando, whether we're talking about me personally making taking a leap of faith. I went to work for Disney, and that was big for me because, I'd worked at Starbucks for a few years and been off to college. I'd been this host at an Italian restaurant, but I'd never really made a big career decision. I'd never made a decision to, pack a couple of suitcases and move far away from home and try something new. And so that was a big shift for me. There was this shift sort of socially, being involved with different people that I'd never imagined possible before, groups that I'd never been a part of before. There was this shift in terms of meeting people in the LGBTQ community who were unashamed and unapologetic and proud of who they were. That was a big shift for me personally. And then to your point, there was this shift culturally that was happening at the same time, where people were really excited about Barack Obama, right? And I think it's easy for us to forget now because things are even more polarized than ever before. And we're thinking like, oh, every election's basically 50-50. Barack Obama's first election was not close. I mean, he was overwhelmingly popular. People were enthralled by him. He really, I think, signaled a shift in America. He signaled a new era of who we were going to be, an acknowledgement that we were going to be a diversifying nation, a browner nation than ever before, a queerer nation than ever before. And so there were all of these things happening. And I think truly, now that I've had an opportunity to put them in the book and have conversations about them, all of those things helped to clear the way for me to learn to be proud of who I am. It was every piece of that sort of gave me the tools necessary to then find a place to belong here in Orlando.
Okay, so all of that's going on, and at the same time, you're moving towards a moment in time when 49 people are going to be shot to death, with you in the bathroom. Two of those are your two best friends. And you're still not at a point where you're sure of your place in the world. You're growing more sure, but then this is taken away when
Right.
their lives are taken away. And then it really does become up to you to fill the void that you feel that they left because they would have done so much more.
Right.
How did you, and where did you, and what made you find that strength?
I've thought a lot about how difficult the journey after Pulse was, and the parts that stand out and the parts that are still kind of blurry. And you'll get some of that imagery in the book as well, as I talk about, there are things that are very vivid and there are things that are not. Um, And one of the, I would say the hardest parts of that journey was figuring out, once everybody left my apartment, once people weren't washing dishes or doing laundry anymore, or bringing food, or, doing the things that you do when you're grieving as a community. Once the last person left and closed the door behind them, when it was really quiet in my apartment, the hardest part of that journey was imagining what the future would look like without my friends. And I had tied so much of my identity, so much of my pride, so much of, so much of who I'd become as an adult was tied to the confidence they gave me, to live authentically and fully as myself. I felt like in their presence, I could finally be all of me. And the hardest part of that journey was imagining what to do without them, because, obviously they're going to leave a hole in your heart. And also, I just didn't know where to go from there. I didn't know what the path would look like. I didn't know how to get myself in a place where I could find the strength or the confidence to carry on. And as we sort of started to move away from the shooting, and people started going back to their regular lives, and they checked in a little less frequently, I realized that part of what I was experiencing was fear. Fear, not just that I would forget Drew and Juan, which is what causes you, to save old t-shirts to make sure you remember how they smell, or save old voicemails so you remember how they sound. But I was really afraid that the things they gave to me, those gifts they gave to me, would be lost forever, that they would just be two names on a wall somewhere, that, they would only matter because of how they died and not because of how they lived. And it was that deep fear and sense of obligation to ensure people knew who they really were and how much value they provided to all of us that propelled me to want to take action. I talk about Drew's funeral in the book, that was a galvanizing moment for me. I talk about watching the national news media talk about the tragedy from only one myopic lens, and that was another galvanizing moment. But underneath all of it was this deep sense of obligation to make sure that my friends meant something, that they meant something not just because of one horrific night, but that they meant something because of what they gave to me. I knew that they'd given that gift to so many others as well. So I think that's what's given me strength over the last 7+ years, is continuing to remind myself that if they were here, they would be doing exactly the same thing, trying to build communities that are inclusive and equal and free for all people to be themselves. And so it's my job to ensure that legacy continues on.
And how much of their friendship while they were alive gave you a certain sense of not only who you were, but the confidence that you were somebody because people like that loved you?
Yeah, it's hard to put into words to articulate the things that especially Drew was, that he was able to give me, that really until I met Drew, as you'll discover in the book's journey, I struggled a lot with just the idea of where I fit in everything. I struggled a lot with, I talk about people who say they're not attracted to men of color, and how that just ripped at my sense of security as a Black man in America. I talk about, struggling with this idea of having to be hyper masculine to fit in situations that people are going to make fun of you for being too feminine, or they won't be attracted to you. And so I was struggling with all of that. And I was also struggling with this sense of displacement, because as a young person, I'd never been able to find my tribe. I'd never been able to find my community. And as a result, I just didn't believe in myself. I didn't believe in myself in any number of fashions. And Drew unlocked that for me. He did it in small ways by showing up, unapologetically himself. I talk about going to dinner with him and being surprised that he never, deepened the gravel in his voice, or stiffened his wrist, or tried to talk more quietly about past relationships because he didn't want the booth to hear us talking about boys instead of girls. He just didn't do that kind of thing because he didn't care. He didn't care if other people heard or could clock him, or, didn't like how his S's would roll off his tongue. He didn't care about any of that stuff. And that ability to show up unapologetically really did give me the confidence to emulate that, to try to be similarly confident. And then he did it in overt ways too. When he would say, first of all, he would challenge me to be the best version of myself. I talk about how he would tell me to fix my face all the time, because that was my shield for the world. I would put on this, resting bitch face for everyone at the bar. And he was like, you got to fix it. People are not going to walk up to you and talk to you if you're clearly putting on an angry front so that, you don't have to communicate with anyone. You got to smile and be friendly and be welcoming to people. He would straight up challenge me on those things and try to make me into a more welcoming and confident, truly self-confident person. And then at other points, he would just pump me up. I mean, he would say things like, I know you love your job, but have you ever thought about what you're going to do? Because you can achieve anything. I think you are so talented and so courageous. And, he would say these things about you can do anything you put your mind to. So for me, it was that combination of his fearlessness, his willingness to call me on the carpet on things that I was using as an emotional shield, and also his relentless ability to pump people up and give them what they needed to get to the next place in their journey. All of that gave me, I think, the ability to be who I am today.
So in some ways, even though it's your memoir, there's a whole hunk of this book that is almost his memoir too.
Yeah. I have said very often over the last 7 years that I don't think I'm the protagonist in my own story. I actually think Drew's the protagonist in the story, and I'm just the narrator. And now I'm here to tell the afterword, right? And so I wanted this memoir, although it is a book about me. It's funny, I got another Amazon review. I've got to stop reading the reviews like that, but I really like to know what people think about the book. But I got an Amazon review that said this book felt a little self-centered, and it's like, I mean, it is a memoir, so you had to know it was going to be about me when you picked it up. But while the book is actually about me and my journey, and it goes from childhood all the way until now, I think you're right to say that it's also not really a book about me, that it is in many ways a book about the other people in my life, including Drew, who have had such an impact on me.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think from my reading of the book anyway, that when he enters the book, you start to transform, but you do it through talking about him and his gifts.
Right.
So one thing that I'm curious about, you have at least one whole chapter on Drew's funeral.
Yeah.
And you never talk about, before that, you talk about reaching out to Juan's sister.
Yeah.
You never talk about Juan being buried. You never talk about him having a funeral. Are they buried together, or did their families put them with their families?
They are not buried together. The families did individual things with them. I think Drew's mom actually planted a tree, and Drew is been cremated and buried with that. It's actually a rainbow eucalyptus tree. It's really beautiful at her home. And so they were buried separately. I think part of why Juan's funeral didn't make it into the book was that it was still so recent. That funeral happened, I think, on Thursday after the shooting. So this is like 4 days after it happened, that it's a blur. I mean, it's a fog for me. I remember some of that day. I remember going to the church. I remember standing in the back. I remember feeling this sort of out of body experience. Like I wasn't even in the room with them. We went to an Olive Garden afterward with the whole friend group, and it was so odd because people were laughing and enjoying each other's company, but there was just this hollowness to all of it for me. And so I think part of why Juan's funeral service didn't make it in the book is that I just don't have that like vivid space in my head for it. I was so traumatized, it's so lost behind a fog, that it's honestly really hard for me to articulate and call back into the present. Whereas Drew's funeral service came a few days later, and it is so crystal clear for me. It is so sharp for me what happened that day. It's like I can almost smell the flowers outside. It is worth saying, by the way, that Juan's funeral service was the same day, by the way, that we met President Barack Obama. We went right from the Amway Arena in Orlando and drove straight down to the funeral home for Juan's service.
So it was a lot to take in one day.
It was a lot. It was a lot. And it was just, it's so hard to explain in those moments what it feels like. People, we go through grief and loss and trauma a lot. So people can probably relate to some of that, but it just feels like you're not even on planet Earth. It feels like there is, an ocean between you and the person standing in front of you. And that's what I felt that day.
And also having met the president, and I mean, that's a lot to come at you after going through the experience of survival mode.
Yeah.
And
There was, and now I'm recalling there was so much about that day. Like I didn't have a suit. And so I had to ask my boyfriend at the time if he could go to the mall and buy me a suit because I didn't have one that would fit to meet the president. There was just so much that was like, it was overwhelming. That was a very overwhelming day.
okay, I mean, I'm sorry that they weren't together at the end. The relationship seemed almost unbelievable. It was so good.
Yeah. In our hearts, they're together forever.
Yes, but it would have been nice if they were both under that same tree. I
Yeah.
mean, jealously or selfishly thinking about meeting them through your lens in the book, because it's interesting because at first you were somewhat jealous of Juan.
Oh, yeah, 100%. And incredulous, right? Because it's like, on the one hand, I was not thrilled about this new, fling that Drew was having. And on the other hand, I had watched him go through some really bad, like relationships, flings. Honestly, I please forgive me, Drew. He had terrible taste in men. And so it was like this cycle that was never ending. And he had just gotten out of this really nasty relationship. And I thought, we're not going to do this again. We can't do this again with somebody else. I don't know if you like if you have it all together to be able to identify if someone is really like worth your time. So I'm going to step in and do what a best friend does, which is to make his life as difficult as possible to try and make sure that he actually is in it for the long haul. But, as I mentioned, Juan was impossible. Not, you just couldn't help but love him. He was exactly like Drew. They had the same energy. You could tell they loved each other from the very moment you saw them together. So although he had terrible taste in men, he really chose a good one in Juan.
How did their relationship ultimately impact your friendship? Because before that, in everything you did, you were together,
Right.
or at least it seems so in the book. And then after, you had to start doing things on your own
Yeah.
because they were together.
A little bit, but I will say that was one of the things that immediately set Juan apart from the other men that Drew had dated, because typically, what happens, your friend meets somebody new and all of a sudden they're enamored with them and they disappear, and you go from hanging out every day to once a week, and then maybe it's once every 2 weeks, and all of a sudden things become tense because your friend is feeling this pull between, people that they care about. That actually really didn't happen with Juan. As soon as Juan was folded into our group, he was everywhere at the same time. Sure, they did things on their own. They went to like movie night and hung out, but Drew was very intentional about, if you are going to be a part of my life, you're going to be a part of my whole life. You're going to be with my friends. We're still going to do all the same things that we want to do. And Juan was so happy and pleased to be a part of that. It's like he was overjoyed every time he could be in the group with people or going out or eating dinner. And so it went from, me going to Drew's place to watch movies to me going to Drew's place to watch movies with Drew and Juan. It didn't really change a whole lot. And I thought that was, for me, another sign that Drew had found someone he actually really truly cared about and loved, that he was so willing from day one to invite this person in to be a part of his community.
And whatever happened to the leather chair?
That's a good question. I don't know what ended up happening to the furniture. That chair and I had a battle because it was not real. It was comfortable. It was my spot, but it also would like consume you if you sat in the wrong places. So me and that chair, we've had a long battle history. I think I'm okay that we let it go, but his mom ultimately took his things and his furniture and his belongings to her home. And so we went to Christmas dinner a couple of years ago at her place, and she had a lot of his stuff around, which was really nice. She had his like TV and his movie collection, and it was really nice to be in that space with some of his energy and vibe again.
Well, just so people know, there was a chair at Drew's apartment where Brandon made himself at home.
That
And
was my spot.
and
Even
so
it's so fun. It's so
okay,
funny because
Sheldon.
Yeah, well, even it was that. It was like even at parties, people would start coming in and people get rowdy and they're loud and they're standing. And then you would see me over in the leather chair with my feet kicked over the side. Like, y'all just let me know when you're ready to go out. I'll be over here.
So it was a sense that you were at home, even though you weren't at home. That's
Totally.
that's how good the relationship was.
Yeah, what's interesting is um, Drew and I lived 2 doors away from each other. I could actually like look out of my apartment and see into his kitchen. And that was in part intentional. I don't know if I actually can't remember if the story is in the book, but Drew inadvertently, I don't know, moved me into that apartment. I had an apartment that I was renting, and he heard from the landlord that somebody was moving out, and he's like, I know the perfect person to move in here. And so he called me and he said, what are you doing after work? And I'm like, whatever, what are we doing? And he said, oh, I want you to come see an apartment. And I said, well, Drew, I have an apartment. Why would I go and look at another apartment? And he said, no, just come and look at it. And so sure enough, it was like a few hours later that I was signing a lease for this apartment. So I moved in 2 doors away from Drew, could peek out and see his place. But all of that to say, his place remained home. Even though I lived 2 doors down, people did not congregate in my apartment. They didn't sit on the couches and the leather chairs and like drape themselves all over the island. I would pack my belongings, bring a bottle of wine and traipse 2 doors down where everyone was in Drew's apartment. His home really was home for everyone, even though I lived just 2 doors away and could very well have welcomed people into my home. Drew's home was our space to be.
That is not in the book, and probably should have been.
Yeah. There are a ton of stories like that.
So what was the most difficult part for you to write? Because there's so many. Wait, before I do that, you talk about how getting straight A's was a strength.
Yeah.
It was the way you proved to people that you were somebody.
Yeah.
And yet there were other times when you failed in school miserably.
Yeah.
How did you reconcile that? Or maybe you didn't reconcile that, but what did that do to your self-esteem and who you were? Or was it unintentionally intentional?
Well, I will say that it certainly wasn't intentional, that part of the journey, but I think what happened for me was in high school and middle school, everything is very structured. It's not like you can, change your schedule or decide to be one place one day and someplace the next. It's like you leave home, you go to school, your schedule is set, you come home at a certain time, you go to bed, you do it all over again the next day. Number one, I thrive in structure. And so I think that helped me to stay grounded in the schoolwork. And so much of the high school experience is about trying desperately to be a part of the social group, right? You want to be part of the in crowd, you want to be popular. And so that was the lane that I was trying to carve out, was like, I can do well in school, I can achieve, I can get into a good school after this, I can do all the things. I can prove that I belong on the same stage as everyone else. And then when I got to college, I lost that structure. I lost, the structure of having home to come home to with my parents every night. I lost the structure of having a really solid social group, friend group. I didn't have the same extracurricular activities anymore. It's almost like you hit reset on the social hierarchy button and you're trying to then find your place in that society again. And I really struggled with that. College is just not the same as high school. In some ways it was. It's like the same crowds of people. You have the same faces that you went to high school with. But in other ways, it's much more challenging to navigate because people have adult responsibilities for the first time. And they're thinking not about, what they're going to do after the dance next week. They're thinking about careers. They're thinking about graduating, getting internships, going and getting a job. They're thinking about marriage and children for perhaps the first time in their lives. And so I really struggled with where to fit in that lane. And while I did really well in college initially, I ended up faltering because that same path wasn't working for me. It wasn't providing me access to the kind of belonging that I needed. And so I supplemented that with trying to do the other things that I thought people would appreciate me for, which is like being at all the right parties, having the right roommates who always wanted to have people over all the time. And that meant I needed to get another job because I couldn't afford to be partying all the time and also going to school. And things really spiraled out of control until ultimately I left school and moved to Orlando.
Did you ever graduate?
I did not graduate.
So all the
It
success.
it remains a source of contention between my dad and I.
I have that same contention with my son, who
I
has not
understand.
graduated.
I totally understand. My dad and I have made peace with where we are today. I've said never say never, but I didn't at that time get a chance to graduate. And it is unfortunate because when I graduated high school, I graduated as a sophomore already in college because of all the credit I had earned. So I really left college like junior year, which feels like a lot of investment to not make it to the finish line. But the truth was, I don't know that I would have made it to the finish line. I actually don't know that I would still be here if I'd tried to stick it out to the end. And so at that time, it was what needed to happen. I had to get out of there.
So you were better in a furry costume.
It was better in a furry costume. I did really well at that too, by the way. Disney loved me.
And see, it's because of that love affair with Disney that they stood up to Ron DeSantis.
It is. It's my relationship. It was me calling Bob Chapek and saying, remember those days when I did so much for you on Main Street? It's time to repay the favor.
And he did and lost his job.
Yeah.
What was, going back to the original question, what was the hardest moment to relive in writing the book? I mean, there were certainly the death of your mother.
Yeah,
has to still stir up some things. The being now a part of a new family, in essence, because there was a remarriage, there are young children, there's that. Then being in school, getting your head banged against lockers, then college, being on your own, but being lonely on your own, and then picking up and moving, and then, of course, Pulse. And all those moments in time that you had to make choices, and you were never, or not often, 100% sure if you would either make it, or if you wanted to make it, or if living was really the answer. What was the toughest nut to crack in writing this memoir?
I would say there are two stories or moments that were the hardest to write about. The first one was not just writing about my mom passing away, which is actually, by the way, the first story that I wrote when I began this journey. I didn't want to start with Pulse because it felt like that's the story I've told so many times that I already knew how I wanted it to sound. I wanted to dive into some of the harder content first and try to unravel it. And so I started writing the story about losing my mom first. And what was hard about it for me was the period of like self-realization that I went through while I was writing it about how that moment affected so many other things that came later in life. Because while I know those things to be true, while I know that, losing my mom then caused me to have difficulty building romantic relationships because I was always afraid that person was going to disappear. I knew that to be true, like intuitively, but I had not ever really written it down from beginning to end and tied those threads together out loud. That part was really hard for me because, I was young when my mom passed away and we didn't get a lot of time to grieve her. My dad struggled with grief. And so there wasn't, we didn't take years to talk through it or get therapists. We just were told to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and keep it moving. And so I never really had the opportunity to pull all of those threads until I started writing this book. And that was really hard for me to do. It was really hard for me to go back and think about how much would be different if my mom were still here. So that part was really hard. And then the second story that was really hard, and I promise I won't give away the whole book, spoiler alert. The second story that was probably the hardest to write was the story of sexual assault in college. And that part was so difficult to write because I had never told that story publicly before. And I knew when I wrote it, I was going to have to, by choosing to write it, I was going to have to make an active decision to be honest about what I went through, not just physically, but all of the emotions, right? The guilt that comes with it, the questioning yourself whether or not you deserved it, whether you put yourself in a situation that you earned that kind of treatment. I was going to have to talk about all of it. And that was going to be really difficult for me to do. And I also knew that people I care about really deeply who had never heard that story before were going to read it for the first time. And I thought a lot about, like, wow, my dad is going to read about this sexual assault and we've never talked about it before. And I don't know how he will perceive that. I don't know if it will be shocking, if he'll be offended that I never told him. I don't know what he's going to do, but those two stories were probably the most challenging for me to sit down and write through.
Were you drugged at that thing, or was it just drinking?
I don't know. I don't, it's a good question and it's possible. I mentioned in the book that there was somebody else at that party who told me that this person was not trustworthy, and that could mean a whole lot of things, including, what you're talking about. But at the end of the day, part of this journey of this book, and my journey with my therapist too, who's really great, has been about unpacking the feeling, the baggage that comes with that, right? Unpacking this idea that you don't deserve that. It doesn't matter what situation you were in. It doesn't matter that it was New Year's Eve. It doesn't matter that you're there with this group of people you don't know. You didn't deserve that. You didn't ask for it. It still was, a violent criminal act perpetrated against you. That has been part of that process. And again, I think that's why it was so important for me that if I was going to choose to write that story, I had to take it all the way from beginning to its final conclusion.
Yeah, no, that was definitely an uncomfortable moment to read through. But I think that you answered your own question about how your father would respond. And even though he had not read the book at that point, he comes to visit you in Orlando, and you hadn't seen each other really for a long time at that point. And he says to you, I'm paraphrasing a little, I'm sorry that I wasn't the person that you would call first.
Yeah.
So I think that is your answer when he was going to read that he was sorry that he wasn't the person that you would call and talk to about it.
Yeah. And that's such a, again, I'll let people read what I think is probably the most beautiful story arc in the book. Obviously, Drew's matters a lot to me. I put a lot of investment into having Drew as a part of this book, but I would argue that my dad has the most beautiful story arc in this book. And it was really important for me to share that part of the journey as well. I'm really proud of him for how far he's come. We are certainly still not the same person. We do not agree on a lot of subjects, but he's really come a long way. And that moment of, reflection and admission and, acknowledgement of how he hurt me over time, that was a big deal for him. I mean, it would be a big deal if he did it again today. And so you're right. I think him sort of acknowledging that, him sitting there in the car and having that moment with me is the answer to a lot of those questions from not just one experience, but a whole lot throughout my life.
And I think that, as you were trying to do in the book, to be a window and a mirror, that a lot of LGBTQ children have that relationship with their parents.
Oh, yeah.
Because their parents just don't understand what you have to go through not to be yourself so much of the time.
Right. And I
know still getting called out for being what you think that you're hiding so successfully.
Exactly right. It doesn't matter if I'm like hiding it or not. People are still calling me things based on who they think I am. But I will say, what I thought was in part so profound about, my dad's moment, his reckoning there in the car, was that he was also acknowledging that what he did and said as a younger adult when I was a kid was really more about his own fear of what would happen to me than anything else. And I think that really speaks to the LGBTQ existence as well, right? That for so many people, their families are afraid. They're afraid of what they will go through. They're afraid of things they don't understand. They're afraid of, you know, how hard that journey might look, and that then manifests as anger and rejection and, you know, all of the ugly toxicity that ends up being in the middle of their relationship. It was just beautiful for me that my dad had that moment of realization, that it was like everything I did was because I was afraid, and being afraid didn't stop any of the bad things from happening.
Right. Very true. And that's why it's an interesting arc in the book, because there's so many chapters where there's no mention of your family at all.
Right.
They're just gone.
Right. Yeah. And that's
And
that. I mean, that was pretty real. They were basically just kind of gone. We still had, you know, connections here and there, but really our emotional relationship was severed for a very long time. And, you know, that's part of, I think, one of the themes of this book is where do you go in that moment when you've lost contact or connection with the people that raised you? Where do you go? And for LGBTQ people, very often you build a chosen family. That is what Drew and Juan were for me. And I think it's also beautiful because, you know, in that moment where my dad has his realization, he had just finished hearing about this chosen family that I built. And I think that was eye-opening for him to see, you know, me as a grown adult having constructed this new family structure. I think was a really necessary moment of honesty between us.
what is the relationship with you and your family like now?
My,
You're still
my dad,
all way 3,000 plus miles away.
we are still 3,000 plus miles away. My dad, you know, he calls to check in. We do not agree on almost anything. And so every conversation usually ends up at a political place where I'm like, you know, I think it's probably best we leave it there for now, and we'll revisit that conversation another day. But you know, we check in. I call him. He calls me every once in a while. My stepmom actually read the book and came to visit me very soon after because she felt so moved that she wanted to come and spend time. I took her to her first drag brunch here in Orlando, where she promptly cried the whole time because she was so overwhelmed by the joy. She just kept saying, "There's so much love in this space." So she had a great time. She came to Orlando. My grandmother, I have two grandmothers living, both really enjoyed the book. My dad's mom, who in many ways is very much like my dad, so you can imagine we don't agree on a lot of things. But my dad's mom, I never got a chance to come out to. And we were really close when I was young because when my mom passed away, she stepped in and did a huge part of the taking care of us. So I'd never had a chance to come out to her, and she texted me asking for a copy of the book. And we've had a pretty distant relationship for years now, in part because, you know, when you're not able to be fully authentically honest with your family, it's hard for you to relate to them because they don't know anything about who you are or the life you're living. So she texted me, she asked me for a copy of the book. I signed one, I sent it to her, and I thought, well, I guess we're having this conversation now because you cannot read this book and be confused about who I am, right? And so she read it. She sent me another text after she'd finished it a couple weeks later, and it was beautiful. I posted it to Instagram. I think it's my most liked Instagram post ever. So congratulations, Grandma, you have that honor. But she basically said, you know, I'm so sorry that we weren't there for you in the way you needed. I just want you to know we loved you then and we love you now.
It doesn't get better than that.
It doesn't.
And that's the perfect place to say, thank you, Brandon. I'm Robert Kesten, Executive Director of Stonewall National Museum, Archives, and Library. Please consider becoming a member so that we can continue to do conversations like this live over Zoom and Facebook and do the other programming that we do. We have a music program coming up this Friday. We have Billy Porter on September. We also have if you haven't seen the documentary, The Stroll on HBO Max, please watch it. The cast and director who's in the cast are coming down to Stonewall in October, and we will explore the trials and tribulations of being trans and living in New York and trying to survive when your family lets you go, when your job lets you go, when your apartment is no longer available, and how as a teenager or someone in your early 20s, how do you survive? It's extraordinarily powerful, first-time documentary by this woman, really amazing. Another instance where people put everything out there and leave it for you to experience. I learned a tremendous amount from that. I learned a tremendous amount from this, and I'm hoping that you will pick it up and read it. A Place for Us, a memoir, Brandon J. Wolfe. What does the J stand for?
Joseph. It is my great-grandfather's name, actually.
And thank you very much for joining us. We are at stonewall-museum.org and would be happy to have you join any of our programs live or via the internet. So thanks very much. Brandon, thank you so much. It reads really fast, which is a good sign, and it's hard to put down because the emotional arcs that run through it and the love that you have for people comes through. And I think that we all have to wish you tremendous success in your career as well, because so many people's lives depend on the work that your organization does. And you are the voice for that at the White House, on cable television, in the news. The face that you didn't always like, which everybody else seems to just love a lot, is very important to be out there. So I'm glad that you've gotten used to and accepting who you are, because we've all known it for as long as you've been the face of Equality Florida, and continued success. Thank you all, and have a good night.